Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is brother Hamza. This is the second Facebook Live. I did announce a few weeks ago that I'll be doing Facebook Lives every Wednesday at 8 p.m. GMT time, which is UK time. And I missed last week. I do apologize. That was because I was busy with being one of the instructors for the scholars and imams that came from Canada. So I tried to fit it in. I tried to get a replacement, but he didn't want to do it. Nevertheless, I'm here now. So let's basically, I'm not going to go through anything. I did that the first week, but I will be using these to go through certain presentations or certain ideas. For example, Islam and morality and all of these things. But today, let's just focus on question and answers, specifically on Islamic thought and philosophy. I'm not a mufti, I'm not a faqih, I'm not a scholar, I'm not a sheikh, so I will not be addressing any questions concerning fiqh related issues, issues to do with jurisprudence. I need to stay in my lane. This is way above and beyond my pay grade, as they say. It's a British saying. So what I'm going to do is basically just take some of your questions on certain topics. We may go for half an hour, maybe more, depending what the topics are. I apologize, I don't have anything, to keep my phone up at the moment. I'm in the office, so I'm just using my hand. So my shoulder may give in soon. I may have to swap hands, so I do apologize. So any questions on, issues to do with, conveying Islam to humanity, with compassion and reason, things to do with God's existence, or to do with prophethood, or to do with, things to do with Islamic thought and philosophy, or even things to do with philosophy in general, since that's my kind of academic background. So just let me know any questions that you may have from that point of view. I can't see any questions. Alright, good. So good question. How do you see scholars trying to prove religion using science? Is this the proper way? That's a very, very good question. Now, I think first and foremost, we firstly have to understand that anyone who tries to, show the coherence of Islam, wants to advocate Islam to the wider public, to our brothers and sisters in humanity, these people, they are sincere, they are compassionate, they're loving, and they have really good intentions. So we always assume that about people who want to convey the call, because conveying Islam, especially in today's social political climate, is not an easy thing to do. So we believe they're sincere, of course, and and they want to do their best. So this point is more of a technical issue. So the question that I just received was, what do you say about using science to prove Islam? Now, it depends what you mean by proof, actually. Now, if you mean by proof that, you can absolutely prove Islam using science, and I think there is a problem here. There is a philosophical problem. Why? Well, in order to address this, you have to first understand what you mean by science. Now, science is a method of study, and what's very interesting, that is limited, by the way, and it's limited to various things. The first thing that it's limited to is the observations it has at hand. As the atheist philosopher of biology, Elliot Sober, he writes this very clearly in his essay called Empiricism, and he relates this to science. He basically says that at any given time, scientists are limited to the observations they have at hand. And this links to the whole philosophical problem of induction, which basically is that, a scientist may have a future observation that can contradict previous conclusions. So a scientist can have a future observation. There is a possibility of not only a future observation, but another observation that can contradict previous conclusions. So what this tells us is that the current data that you have, the current observations that you have, are limited. And therefore you're restricted to that limited data. It could be possible that you can see something from a different perspective. You may have another layer of observation, for example, or you may have another new observation that can be at odds with your generalizations. So this is a particular, not a problem, it's actually one of the beauties of science, because science, always wants to change its knowledge, always wants to change its conclusions, because it understands that we're not going to have an infinite number of observations. We don't have infinite knowledge. We're always going to have the pixel, and we're just adding more pixels to our understanding. We don't have the full picture of reality or phenomena. So from that point of view, it's very important. You can't really use science to prove anything really, if you mean by proof here that Islam is absolutely true. Of course not, because you're using a methodology or using a premise that can change, which is that you can have a future observation that contradicts previous conclusions. So my advice to the brothers and sisters, anyone watching, is for you to really read into the philosophy of science. It would really empower you, because it would help you understand that there's no big problem. There is no kind of, war against there's no war between religion and science. It's not the case at all. Also, with regards to the philosophy of science, and I do suggest you read this, read about the debates on realism and anti-realism and even instrumentalism in the philosophy of science. Now, let's just focus on realism and anti-realism. So one group said that scientific theories, represent reality. They are a representation of the state of affairs. Another group of philosophers of science basically said, no, theories are just approximations of representations of the state of affairs from that point of view. Now, there was a big debate in the philosophy of science. One said theories, do align with the truth. They said theories, they're just approximations of the truth. To cut a long story short, and I don't want to bore you with academia here, basically they all agree now, both camps agree that science can change. Theories, even if they're very well confirmed, do not indicate any absolute truth. So, from that point of view, if you're saying, can science prove religion from an absolute way, or prove Islam from an absolute way? Absolutely not. And even from a theological perspective, think about the names of Allah. Think about the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah is Al-Hakim, right? Sorry for the camera. So Allah is Al-Hakim. He has the totality of wisdom and knowledge. He is Al-Alim. He has the totality of knowledge. He knows everything, right? So from that point of view, we're always going to have a limited understanding of reality, because Allah by definition is the one who has the total knowledge and wisdom. If you want to think of it this way, think of it as Allah has the picture, we just have a pixel. So Allah has the picture, we just have a pixel. So to claim that our pixelated and fragmentary understanding of the world is going to lead to absolute truth is a bit of a problem. However, notwithstanding this, you have to also appreciate that when it comes to very basic direct observations, no one's going to deny and say that these things are now not based on the truth. That would be a ridiculous thing. Like, when we see something is round, you conclude something is round. No one's going to say, no, that round thing is actually square. Okay, that would be a type of skepticism that is absolutely ridiculous. My shoulder's getting really tired. Let me just try and change this around somehow. There you go. No, that's too dark. I'll hold my other hand. Right, so from that point of view, I wouldn't use science to prove religion. And even the words proof, we have to really understand here, okay? Actually, before I get into that, let's now focus on the problem of induction. Say, most scientific theories or scientific conclusions are based on something called induction. Now, what is induction? Well, technically, what is inductive arguments? Now, inductive arguments are where you have a limited set of observations, or you have a limited set of data, and you conclude for an unknown, okay? Or you conclude for the next observation, or the next set of observations. Let me give you an example. I observe 1,000 white sheep, therefore all sheep are white. Or, I observe 1,000 white sheep, therefore the next sheep is going to be white. Now that is not a conclusive argument. It's not like a deductive argument. The conclusion doesn't necessarily follow from the data, from the premises, from your observations. It's an inference, right? It's probabilistic. It ranges from 0% to 99.9%, because there could be a possibility of a new observation contradicting your previous generalizations. Now, David Hume spoke about this, and there's been a huge debate, and to be honest, it hasn't really been solved. So from that point of view, if you use induction, you may have a future observation that contradicts previous conclusions. You may have, for example, an observation of a black sheep, and that observation of a black sheep would be in contradiction to your conclusion based upon your limited data, because you've seen 1,000 white sheep and you're concluding the next sheep is going to be white, but now you've actually really observed a black sheep. Now that contradicts your conclusion based on your limited data. Now, most scientific theories are actually based on inductive arguments. this is why even the kind of evangelical scientist, Richard Dawkins, I nearly forgot his name, he basically even mentions this about the Darwinian mechanism. He says the Darwinian mechanism may change. We may have observations or insights into science that can contradict our previous conclusions based on limited data. And this is the point. So therefore we should basically not be evangelical when it comes to science. And obviously we love science, Islam loves science, human beings should love science. You know, one of its beauties is the inductive method, because when you see new data, new evidence, you're going to change your views. But we have to be very careful when we're using it as proof, because there would always be a possibility of a future observation or another observation being in contradiction with your conclusions that were based on limited data. So that's very important to note as well from that point of view. So, notwithstanding this, I think the question also needs to be addressed from the point of view on what do you mean by proof, okay? Because, let me just change the angle here to use my other hand. My hand's really hurting now. My shoulders are hurting. So, when you use the word proof, now, what do you mean by proof? Now, sometimes we have a kind of neo-rationalistic understanding of the Islamic tradition, which I think is very incoherent when you understand who Allah is and you understand revelation. Everything has first principles, okay, brothers and sisters and friends, everything has first principles. This is not just a religious idea. Science has first principles. You could call this metaphysics, you could call this philosophical assumptions, call it whatever you want. But the point is, everything has first principles. There is no a philosophy-free science. There is no a metaphysics-free idea from that point of view. Let me give you an example. Consider science. If you study science and you study the philosophy of science, it's based on certain assumptions. One of the assumptions includes that there are external causal connections in the world. You have to assume that there are external causal connections, that causality actually exists, that there is a causal link between a perceived effect and its prior cause. You have to assume that. But if you study metaphysics and you study causality in itself, they haven't even agreed on what causality is. They haven't agreed. There is no philosophical consensus on what is a causal link. But you have to assume it in order for science to work. Another thing you have to assume for science to work is that you have rational faculties. That your faculties can allow you to basically make inferences and can allow you to basically form conclusions from previous data, that you have a rational mind, a distinguishing mind that can eventually allow you to lead to sound conclusions. That is another assumption. And there are many, many more assumptions, but the point is, these assumptions, or first principles if you like, are necessary in order for you to have scientific knowledge. Now, you don't study this in science because people rarely study the philosophy of science these days, unless you go on an academic level. Similarly, with all other types of philosophy, you have what you call metaphysical principles or first principles. Now, Islam also has its first principle, which is, in my view, the concept of the fitrah. Now, I'm not going to talk about this at length now, but I want to basically address this maybe next week or the week after to go into detail on the role of the fitrah in Islamic metaphysics and epistemology, okay? So, but as a basic idea, the idea of the fitrah is essentially something that has been created within us to acknowledge Allah and to praise Him. So to acknowledge Allah and to praise Him. Now, this acknowledgement and this praise is a form of knowledge. According to many of the ulama, many of the scholars, this is a form of knowledge. You could call it proto-knowledge or primary knowledge, but it exists within the fitrah. That we have something in our innate disposition. So the fitrah is the innate disposition that has been created by God within us. And in that innate disposition, we have an acknowledgement of Allah as our Lord, as our Creator. And we have the kind of capacity and affinity or the knowledge that Allah deserves praise. Okay? So this is the fitrah. There are other ulama who also add another dimension to the fitrah, a third dimension, which is that you have innate basic level of morality, or you can recognize good. Okay? Now, what's very interesting that this idea of the fitrah is actually justified by a prophetic tradition from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he basically said that in a hadith in Sahih Muslim, in a prophetic tradition in Sahih Muslim, he said that every human being, every child is born in a state of a fitrah, and it's his child, and it's his parenting, his parents actually make him into someone of another religion. So many ulama, many scholars say it's the effects of socialization that cloud the fitrah. Now there's been a further scholarly discussion on this, and the idea here is that a pure fitrah, a pure innate disposition, will recognize Allah, recognize God as the creator, and also believe that He deserves worship or deserves praise. However, this fitrah can become unclouded. It can become unclouded. So bear in mind that the truth already exists within us. It just becomes clouded. Our job now is to try and help people uncloud their fitrah. Now, the way to do that is that you could use rational arguments, you can use just good behavior, you can use positive experiences, you could experience negative experiences yourselves, you could just read the Quran, read Revelation, you can just do tadabbur and tafakkur, you could basically ponder and reflect, and all of these things can act as means to awaken the truth within. They can act as means to basically uncloud the fitrah. And that's very powerful. So when the fitrah becomes unclouded by use of reason, use of revelation, use of pondering, having experiences, these can uncloud the fitrah and allow the truth within to shine through. So you could accept the truth. Now what does this mean? This has profound implications for use of kind of cold, abstract rationality. Because there is nothing intrinsic about a rational argument. Rational arguments do not lead to hidayah, to guidance rather, not truth but to guidance. Guidance is from Allah, is from the Creator, and it's in line with His mercy and wisdom. There's nothing intrinsic about reason or intrinsic about pondering or intrinsic about these spiritual experiences that would lead to guidance. Rather, they act as means to uncloud the fitrah, to awaken the truth within. I repeat, rationality, experiences, pondering, all of these things act as means to awaken the truth within. They act as means to uncloud the fitrah, to awaken the truth within, which is very important because there is no rational algorithm that would lead to guidance. Don't get me wrong, I do believe there are some absolute arguments, but they're very rare, and the arguments are very limited in what they can conclude, and those arguments are universal and they can be found in the Quran as well. But to think that there's this whole category of philosophy, this rationalist kind of approach to the world that's going to lead to truth and lead to guidance, this is absolutely what I would call a very weak position. It's not very academic. It's apologetics and it's not academic, because everything has first principles. You have to start with something that is really unprovable in order for you to build on, in order for you to have a coherent understanding of the world. So I think the fitrah approach to Islam is very, very powerful. And this affects the way we convey the call to people. It basically means that we're here to plant the seed, that we're here to help uncloud people's innate disposition so the truth within can be awakened. And that's very profound, because it can mean that when you have a conversation with someone, you're not going to solely rely on rational arguments, but rather you can rely on, just being a good person, man, or just sharing experiences, or using an existential approach to life, which I think is very, very powerful and very Quranic. Existential approach means, what does it mean for me to exist? Things about, values and my state of being, and how does revelation and religion and connection with Allah change my heart and change my state of being, and what is my state of being in the world? These are very powerful things that are very Quranic from that point of view. So, don't think it's just rational arguments, this amazing proof that will bring people to Islam. No, people have a fitrah, an innate disposition. Within it has primary knowledge of praising Allah and acknowledging Him. It can be clouded, and what can uncloud the fitrah for the truth to shine through, for the truth to be awakened, right? What can uncloud the fitrah are rational arguments, but they're not ends, they're just means. And it can be just reading Revelation, it can be having good experiences, it can be just praying. Like, I remember when I became Muslim, the thing that really was, hit the nail on the head, it was the bullseye for me, was not the rational arguments. I started to pray. And in sajda, in prostration, the prostration, when you prostrate with your face is the symbol of the ego. My ego was diminishing from that point of view. So it's very, very critical for us to understand the fitrah approach to these issues. So I know this was a long answer to a short question, but I think I had to do it in this way, and I'm going to expand on it in later weeks as well. And plus, you can read my book. My book addresses some of these issues, the divine reality. So I had to go and make you understand some aspects of the philosophy of science in order to understand why we can't prove Islam or religion with it from that point of view. And I also had to address what you mean by proof, if you mean absolute arguments kind of thing, and to make you understand that, how can we get guided from a fitrah point of view, that there's no kind of rational algorithm that you put together that leads to truth and guidance. It doesn't work that way, because human beings are spiritual, and human beings are rational, and they're emotional, and there's psychological phenomena involved. So you have to appreciate from that point of view. So sorry for not keeping my phone still. I do apologize. It's because my hand's hurting now. I don't have the stand thing. I'll get it for next week. So yeah. Anyway, any other questions? Let me take one more. So that question was on scholars using science to prove religion. I gave my 10 cents, if you like, on it. Any other questions? Okay, can you explain why a brain scan cannot be the inner subjective conscious experience? Okay, good. This is, very big. This is a big question. I'm going to present to you guys the hard problem of consciousness from an Islamic point of view and philosophical point of view, because I specialize this in my in my postgrad. But I'm not going to go too much into it, okay? So let me suggest this question. The reason neuroscience or neuroscientific studies or neurobiological studies cannot address the hard problem of consciousness, the reason neuroscience can't do that is because neuroscience mainly is a study of correlations, okay? It's a study of correlations. So what they see neurochemical firings in the brain, and they correlate it to basically people's descriptions of the subjective experience. It's not causal. Now, if you study neuroscience and the philosophy of biology, and even the philosophy of neuroscience, right, neurophilosophy, you would see, many people like Moderato and Manzotti and Relson and many others, they all agree that neuroscience is not philosophically free. There is no philosophy-free neuroscience. Neuroscience is based on what you call physicalist assumptions. Physicalist assumptions. Now, what does physicalist assumptions mean? Physicalism basically means, in a nutshell, that phenomena can be explained by physical processes. Not necessarily little bits of matter. That would be more materialism. But physicalism means that phenomena can be explained by physical processes. That is an assumption of neuroscience. Now, even if you were to correlate subjective experiences or descriptions of subjective experiences with neurochemicals firing patterns in the brain, this doesn't mean now that the patterns in the brain are identical to your inner subjective conscious experiences. That is an assumption. Neuroscience can never prove that. Go to anyone in academia. Forget this neuromania that's going on, right? That you see on Popular Science, right? Go to the academia. Neuroscience can never prove its own assumptions. It will be like a big circular argument. It has to assume that physical processes are identical to inner subjective conscious experiences. And then it goes into the world, it does the amazing studies, and we respect and love neuroscience, does amazing studies, and it correlates, not causal, it correlates neurochemicals firing, patterns in the brain, to people's descriptions of inner subjective conscious states. All it's doing is showing a correlation. It's actually not proving it's identical. And even from a metaphysical point of view, you can never show it's identical, because neurochemicals firing are so different from inner subjective conscious states. You can never claim that they're the same. And if you do, it's an assumption that you cannot prove. So the point here is neuroscience is an assumption, its assumption is a physicalist assumption, which basically means, let me just move my phone, I do apologize, which basically means that all phenomena can be reduced to physical processes. It has to start with that assumption. But just merely seeing neurochemicals firing in the brain and correlating it to inner subjective conscious states is actually not evidence at all. It's just evidence for correlation, not evidence that they are identical. And that is the point here. So that's the way to address that question. And a really good book, it's academic but it's quite easy to read, is by, even he's an atheist philosopher, his Professor Raymond Tallis, and the book that he wrote was published by Routledge, and it's called Aping Mankind. It's a really good book. I think that would be a good starter in order to get into these areas. But I'm going to address more of this much later. Another question that I just raised. Okay, one question is really good. So, Sheikh Taqi-uddin Nabahani's grand arguments about reality of the universe and life, how is your future point of view differs from his Tariq al-Iman? Well, it doesn't really, because what the Sheikh did, he revived a classical argument that many of the ulama, many of the scholars used. And what I mean by scholars, I mean scholars from the different schools of creed. Because the unique thing about the argument that he used is what you call the argument from contingency, or you want to call, I like to call it the argument from dependency, right? This argument was used by all scholars from different schools of creed, from the Ash'ira, from the Maturidis, from the Atharis, from all schools of creed. They actually use this argument. It's a very universal argument, which is very profound. Yes, you may have to tweak it here and there for certain schools of creed, but generally speaking, it's basically a creed neutral kind of argument. And that argument is very powerful. Absolutely. I think it's one of the most powerful arguments that we have, because it transcends science, because it's a metaphysical argument. It's based on first principles. And maybe I could go through that argument at one point, during the Facebook Lives. So, yes, it's a great argument, but does that argument lead to guidance? Of course not. Absolutely not. No one could ever claim that. And does that argument lead to 100% conviction? No, because if someone's an excessive skeptic, he may take some of the basic assumptions of the argument, and all arguments have assumptions, and just basically say, I disagree with your assumptions. Obviously, it would be foolish to do so. And that's why we have to be careful when we use the word absolute, right? It's a brilliant argument. It's very conclusive. Does it lead to guidance? No. Allah guides. Can it be one of the means that awaken the truth within? Absolutely. Another question I have is that another question that was received was about, what do you say about the scholars of the past that rejected philosophy? Now, this is a very interesting question, okay? The first thing I want you to do is that you need to go to Islamicate. I have an article on Islamicate that says, Islamicate.co.uk, I believe. There's an article that I wrote which is called, Is Philosophy Forbidden? Okay? And in that article I try and unravel some of the nuances here, because it's basically the way we use language. What was forbidden by some scholars, and a lot of scholars actually, was the concept of, and listen very carefully, blameworthy ilmul kalam. Blameworthy ilmul kalam, which is not blameworthy philosophy, it was called blameworthy, speculative theology, or speculative theophilosophy. Why did they say that you should not use blameworthy ilmul kalam? Because by definition, blameworthy ilm al-kalam was based upon assumptions that could not be traced back to the Quran and the Sunnah and the Islamic tradition. Okay? However, did they reject kalam, theophilosophical thinking altogether? Of course not. And this is the criterion. So here's the criterion. And it's very basic. We have to go into it in detail another time. But let me give some criteria. If what you're articulating, regardless if it sounds complicated or if it's in a clever language, that's neither here or there. If what you're articulating is based on assumptions and premises that can be found in the Quran and the Sunnah in the Islamic tradition, then it's not a problem. That's the general rule. However, if what you're articulating and arguing has premises and assumptions that are antithetical to the Quran and Sunnah and go against the Islamic tradition, then you can't use it. It will be blameworthy. And the main reason that is blameworthy is because you're going to contradict yourself, and you may end up doing the most ridiculous thing and changing Islam from a philosophical and creedal point of view. That was the main criteria. Now, even I know I'm a huge lover of Al-Ghazali, the 11th century theologian, and he went on that journey too. And in his works, he made it very clear. He said, don't be under any assumption that using these abstract philosophical arguments are going to lead to Iman, lead to faith, lead to this inner spiritual conviction with Allah. Don't be under any assumption. These arguments are a necessary evil. I think he even believes, he calls it's like medicine. It's only for the one who is sick from that point of view. Because if you give medicine to someone who's not sick, they can get sick. So it's not for everybody. Also, my advice for anyone who wants to study philosophy, they have to understand the fitrah, that approach that I spoke about a few minutes ago, and they have to have the following things in place, okay? So even on an academic level, if you want to study philosophy, then you have to have the following in place. Number one, a relatively foundational understanding of your creed, of Islamic creed. Number two, a relatively close connection with Allah. Number three, connection with scholars that can help guide you. That's very important. If you have those three things in place, then hopefully you won't get into any serious issues from that point of view. Okay? So that would be my advice on that issue. So, how long have we been going for? I don't know. Let me check the time. I have no idea. So, I think it's been about half an hour. We've addressed 3 questions. This video will be up on the Facebook page, so you could review it just to see the questions. If you have further questions, I do always appreciate, because of time, because of language, because of passion, sometimes people could be misunderstood. If you have any misunderstandings or require more clarity, just contact me, okay? And what I'll do, I'll see you next Wednesday with further questions, okay? Take care, guys. Really good engaging with you. Sorry for the shakiness on the phone. I'll try and fix that not tomorrow, for next week, inshallah. I love you guys for the sake of Allah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.